All right, we will go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to today's Be Well Lunch and Learn titled Home Food Preservation Introduction to Preserving. We are so excited to have our friends Andy and Nicole from Penn State Extension here to talk about this topic, which is very timely, seeing as the summer is unfortunately coming to an end. Many of you may be interested in doing home food preservation here, moving into the fall season. Andy and Nicole, they'll go over some Zoom housekeeping tips. But before passing it over to them, I just want to remind you that these are recorded. So if you cannot stay with us for the entire session or would just like to review this at another time, we will be sending out the recording and the PowerPoint slides in a follow-up email, which will hopefully go out today. You can also visit all our recordings on our Be Well website as well. So, with that, I will turn this over to Andy and Nicole. Thank you.
Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us today for Home Food Preservation Introduction to Preserving. And as she just mentioned, we will go over a little bit of Zoom housekeeping. At the bottom of your screen, the chat, we don't monitor that as frequently. So if you have any questions, we do ask you that you type them into the Q&A pod, and then we might answer some as we're going along, or we might answer them at the end of the presentation, but we will get back to you, and that's an easier way for us to find the questions in that pod. And for those of you who may not know us, Penn State Extension is an outreach arm of Penn State University, and we're part of the College of Agricultural Sciences. Extension is part of a national land grant university system, so every state and the District of Columbia have at least one extension service associated with them. And the mission of Extension is to translate research and developments from the university into useful information for the larger community. And our goal is to deliver unbiased, science-based information to individuals, businesses, and communities. And on the next slide here are different program areas that we cover. Maybe you've heard of the 4-H Youth Development Program or Master Gardeners. They are all part of Penn State Extension. And maybe you even engaged in with one of our extension educators to ask a question about home food preservation, or maybe to get a soil test kit for your garden. And here in Pennsylvania, every one of our 67 counties does have an extension office associated with them. And I'm sure you're familiar with this, but we are able to fulfill our mission through federal, state, and local funding. And as a publicly funded entity, we're committed to making our information as accessible as possible. So this presentation is available in alternative media upon request. And you may hear us mention specific brands or retailers, but we are in no way endorsing them. It's just for illustrative purposes. So today I wanted to introduce ourselves. My name is Nicole McGeehan, and we have Andy Herneisen as well. We are both food safety educators, and we teach food safety certification classes like the ServSafe program to food service professionals. We also work with nonprofit organizations and deliver a course called Cooking for Crowds, a volunteer's guide to safe food handling. And we work with individuals also in the area of home food preservation, which is what we'll be talking about today. What we'll be covering today is the best practices for freezing food to ensure a safe quality product, best practices for dehydrating and freeze drying foods to ensure, again, a safe quality product, and the proper procedures for canning food, including pressure canning, water bath, or atmospheric steam canning, and the importance of using tested recipes. So first, I am going to talk about freezing foods. And many people choose freezing because most foods maintain a high quality when you freeze it. It doesn't take a lot of time. It doesn't really take a lot of effort. Like if you were doing any kind of canning, you know, that produces a lot of heat in your kitchen, which is not going to happen when we're freezing foods. But there are some foods that just don't freeze well. Things like lettuce, cabbage, celery, zucchini, cucumbers, radishes, sprouts, eggplant. They don't really freeze that well. Neither do potatoes, macaroni, rice, or fried foods. Cooked egg whites, meringues, custards, milk sauces, icings, they tend to separate in the freezer, so they don't freeze that well. Some cheeses can freeze okay, like if you were using shredded mozzarella cheese that you're planning on melting on a pizza afterwards, that would be okay. And then some sour creams and salad dressings don't freeze well either. When we're preparing food for freezing, our goal is to first deactivate any enzymes in that produce. So enzymes are what make the produce continue to ripen. And by deactivating them, it protects from color, flavor, and texture changes. So different ways that we can prepare foods for freezing would be either blanching them with steam or boiling water, meaning dipping them in boiling water or putting them in a steam basket for a few minutes. Or may be recommended to use commercial mixtures like on the slide here, there's a picture of Fruit Fresh or even vitamin C tablets that you can just crush up yourself. When we're freezing, it's important the goal is to have these foods freeze as quickly as possible because rapid freezing is going to improve the quality after thawing that product back to cook it or prepare it in any way. So on the left side of the slide here, you can see that this is an example of rapid freezing. So the ice crystals are much smaller, so they're staying within those cell walls, and there's less cell damage when we go to thaw the product. If the product is frozen more slowly, you can see that those ice crystals are now going through the cell wall, so they're creating cell damage. They're making larger ice crystals, so then when we go to thaw it, we're not going to have as great of a quality product. There are several different methods for freezing food, and the first we'll talk about is dry pack. And dry pack is good for small whole fruits like berries. It gives a good quality product without having to add any extra sugar or syrups. So we can just simply pack these fruits into a container, seal it, and freeze it. Or vegetables work for this as well, like something like peas. Tray pack is an alternative to a dry pack, and this is where you simply spread a single layer of the prepared fruit or vegetable on a shallow tray and freeze it. And about after an hour or when it's frozen enough, we're going to just then package it into maybe a Ziploc container or a plastic container. And the benefit to tray packing is that everything doesn't freeze together in a clump. So for example, you see the blueberries on the slide there. If we let them freeze a little bit first and then put them into a freezer bag, then they're going to be loose when we need to go to use them. So it's not just going to be one clump altogether. So if you were freezing blueberries, for example, for smoothies and you're only going to use a handful at a time, it is recommended to use this kind of tray pack. A syrup pack can be used for better texture and it helps to maintain that product, especially if you're going to be using it for something like a pie filling or something like that afterwards. If you're using the syrup pack, the sugar suppresses the freezing point of water and offers a protection of texture with this. The sugar can also add flavor. So if you wanted to use this, just a general syrup ratio would be 1 cup of sugar to every 4 cups of water. You would make this solution up and then pour it over top of the fruit. And we want to make sure that all that fruit is submerged under the liquid. So we do recommend crumpling up a piece of water-resistant paper and placing it over top so that that fruit stays underneath the liquid. And it does matter what kind of packaging that you're using when you're freezing foods. If you are using something that's not intended for freezing, you might not get that great of a quality product when you go to defrost it. So make sure if you're using plastic bags that you use ones that say that they are freezer bags. If you compare a freezer bag to a storage bag, if you have both of those at home, you can go home and compare it. You'll notice that the freezer bag's a lot thicker than the storage bag. So there's going to be um, more protection for that product. You can also use heavy duty aluminum foil. Vacuum sealers work great because they're going to suck all that extra air out of the bag, and they usually provide the best quality if you have a vacuum sealer. You can use laminated freezer paper or freezer containers or boxes, and you'll know that your containers are freezer safe. Something that you can look for is that sometimes they have a little snowflake on the bottom of it, and that will indicate that that container is safe to be put in the freezer. So that was an overview of freezing foods. We definitely could get into a lot more detail, but today we're just doing an introduction into different parts of home food preservation. So the next is going to be on drying foods. And let's talk about some of the advantages to drying foods first. It's lightweight, it's portable, it's more shelf stable. A lot of times, especially with fruit, it concentrates the flavor, makes it really sweet. Like if you were dehydrating apple rings, for example, it makes them a nice treat because they're really sweet and concentrated. You can dehydrate vegetables, for example, to use over the winter for your soups. You can make snacks that you can use for hiking or camping. And drying removes moisture from food, so bacteria, yeast, and mold cannot grow and spoil the food. Drying also slows down the action of enzymes, but it does not completely inactivate them. During drying, food becomes smaller and lighter in weight. And for some dried foods, when we're ready to use them, we do want to add water back to them so that it returns to its original shape. For example, if you were dehydrating vegetables or beans for soups, you might want to put them in some water to let them soak that water up before you put it into your recipe. Foods can be dried using a variety of methods, but the right combination of warm temperature and airflow is really important. So the optimal temperature for drying foods is 140 degrees Fahrenheit. This warm temperature causes the moisture to evaporate, but we don't want to rush this process by turning up the heat because that can cause something called case hardening. And with case hardening, the outside of the product will dry before the inside. So it traps moisture inside, which can then lead to mold. So that optimal temperature of 140 is the most preferred method for drying foods to avoid case hardening. If you decided that you wanted to start dehydrating foods and you're looking for a dehydrator, there are different types that you can purchase. Some things that you may want to look for when purchasing a dehydrator are, does it have a variable heat control? So some dehydrators, when you plug it in, it's already set to 140 and we can't really change that much. So maybe that's a feature that you might want to look for. You want to look for fan for airflow. So the dehydrator on the screen at the top, that white one there, that has the fan on the bottom, where the dehydrator on the bottom of the screen has the fan along the back. So that the bottom there is considered a horizontal flow dehydrator because the air is flowing horizontally across the food, and the one at the top is a vertical. We want to look to see how easy they are to load and unload, and you can check to see if they have timers on them. So some have a digital display where there's a timer, and that's a nice feature so that it turns off automatically if you weren't like home when it finished, or maybe it might finish in the middle of the night, you don't want to wake up. So that is a nice feature to look for as well. On the top there, that vertical flow dehydrator, those are definitely take up a lot less space. A lot of them have trays that collapse into each other, so it gets a lot smaller. Where the one on the bottom, the horizontal flow, that one really does take up a lot of counter space. So that's another thing that you'll want to consider when purchasing a dehydrator. So you really don't need any type of equipment to dry some foods like herbs, for example. Um, Drying is the easiest method for preserving herbs, and you just need to expose them to warm, dry air so you can leave them out in a well-ventilated area. There is another method called sun drying, which is drying foods outside, but we don't really recommend that here in Pennsylvania because our weather, it can go from like, as we've all witnessed over the past week, it can go from like freezing cold last week to really hot this week. So we can't really rely on outdoor drying here in Pennsylvania. If you're drying some herbs, the best time to harvest them is just before the flowers first open by gathering them early in the morning after the dew has evaporated. Rinse them under running cool water and shake them to remove any excess water. Make sure you're only drying your non-bruised and unsoiled leaves and stems because the better quality product you start with, the better outcome you're going to have. The easiest herbs to dry with air room drying would be rosemary, sage, thyme, and parsley. And you can put a bag over top of them. Just make sure you poke some holes in the bag. And that way, if any leaves fall, the bag would catch that for you. And you can just hang them in a room. You don't want to put it in a humid room because they will not dry really that quickly. Another method for drying herbs would be in the microwave. And in the microwave, you can dry your herbs just in a single layer on a paper towel. It usually takes a total of 2 minutes, but we only want to dry them in 30-second increments so that we don't start a fire in the microwave. So you can rinse them, like I mentioned earlier, dry them, put them on a paper towel in the microwave for 30 seconds, stop the microwave, stir them around a little bit, and then keep adding on those 30-second increments until it is dry and crumbly. The last thing I want to talk about just with regular drying in a dehydrator would be jerky. If you're planning on drying jerky, it's best to use lean meat and remove any fat from that meat. Cut the meat into uniform thin strips, no thicker than 1/4 inch. And you can slice with the grain if you like a more chewy jerky, and across the grain if you like a more tender jerky. We really, really, really recommend this step because this is going to stop any potential bacterial growth in that meat before you go to dry it in the dehydrator. So we want you to heat those strips in a boiling marinade. You can marinate it overnight or prior to blanching for more if a more intense flavor is desired. And this step should not be skipped because we want to destroy any potential pathogens in that food before we put it into the dehydrator. Then we would put those strips in the dehydrator and dry at 140 degrees Fahrenheit, rotating the trays throughout if necessary. You'll know that your jerky's done if it cracks at the surface when you bend it. And for longer storage, you can store them under refrigeration or freeze them. So lastly, I'm going to talk about freeze drying foods, which has become a little bit more trendy in recent years. I'm sure you've seen a lot of freeze dried foods in the grocery store, and I've seen a lot lately, like freeze dried candies like Skittles. So I'm just going to explain this process as a little bit of an overview to what freeze drying is. Freeze drying is when raw or cooked foods are placed in the freeze dryer where they are frozen first to between -30 and -50 degrees Fahrenheit. Once the product is frozen, the freeze dryer creates a vacuum in the food chamber, and as the food is gradually warmed within this chamber, the water turns to vapor and it evaporates out of the food, and this is called sublimation. So once you put those products into the freeze dryer kind of does all the work for you. This process it could take a long time. It could take up to 2 days or 48 hours. But the good news is many foods can be freeze dried. Really, the only foods that don't freeze dry well are fatty foods, honey, and syrups. When you're pre-treating foods for freeze drying, it is similar to pre-treating for dehydrating. If you're freeze drying meat, it's important to note that freeze drying does not kill bacteria. So you need to label that meat well to know that it was raw before you freeze dried it, because after you freeze dry it, it might not be as easy to tell between raw and cooked meat. So you must cook the meat either before freeze drying it, or if you're doing it after it, make sure you label that product and be mindful of cross-contamination. So similar to dehydrating, you can pre-treat fruits and vegetables before freeze drying them by either peeling, slicing, removing seeds. It is really easy, like for strawberries, for example, it doesn't require much pre-treatment. We just need to slice those strawberries and put them on the tray. But something like bananas, they might require some extra pre-treatment because they could start to turn brown. Freeze-dried foods can be eaten dried. If you have a diet of complete diet of freeze-dried foods, though, you do want to be careful of dehydration since there's no natural moisture in those foods anymore. You can reconstitute the foods before eating them or using them in a recipe, or you can use them directly in recipes like soups. These are becoming a lot more popular, and although freeze dryers are still pretty expensive, they have come down a lot in cost in recent years. And what about nutrition when it comes to freeze drying? And nutrition, the good news is that it is pretty similar to fresh foods, but it is easy to eat more calories, especially on the last slide I showed you, those freeze dried apple rings. It's really easy to eat a lot of those because they are so good and lightweight and delicious. So I am now going to turn it over to Andy, and he's going to talk about canning foods.
All right, thanks, Nicole. So canning food is another way that we can prepare our food for long-term storage. And canning preserves foods by killing and controlling the growth of microorganisms that can cause our food to spoil or become unsafe. It also inactivates enzymes, just like Nicole was talking about enzymes when we're dehydrating or freezing. We want to keep oxygen out and keep moisture in. So the microorganisms, acidity, our heat processing, and our seal are four important factors that we need to talk about. So when we talk about microorganisms, we could have yeast and yeast and mold can cause cloudiness, that's turbidity. They could cause the colors to change or flavors to change, and it's not usually a safety concern, more of a quality concern. But we are concerned about mold because certain types of mold produce toxins called mycotoxins. Myco is Greek for mold. And those toxins can hang in different systems of your body. So it's not that the concern isn't, oh, I ate a moldy peach for lunch today and now my stomach hurts. The illness, it doesn't happen right away. It's a buildup over time. It can lead to things like cancer later on down the road. So we want to limit our exposure to those potential toxins. So whenever food is moldy, and we're not just talking home prepared food and preserved food, anything that's moldy, safest thing to do is throw it out. But the biggest microorganism that we're concerned about when it comes to home canning is Clostridium botulinum. This bacteria causes botulism toxin, and this can be deadly. And if it doesn't kill you, it is a long, expensive, and timely recovery. This bacteria is found everywhere. It's found in the soil, found in water, found in food. And the living form of the bacteria isn't what we're so concerned about. We're concerned about this bacteria produces spores. And spores are like little survival pods or seeds that can endure years of adverse conditions, waiting for the conditions to become correct, to germinate and grow. And when they grow into the living form of the bacteria, that's when they release that deadly botulism toxin. So we want to help to control the environment to prevent the risk from this bacteria. So controlling the environment, one of the things we can do is controlling acid. So typically, when we're thinking about acid, we measure that on the pH scale, where 0 is very acidic, 14 is very alkaline or basic, and 7 in the middle is neutral. But when it comes to canning food, we have a different dividing line, and that dividing line is 4.6. So anything with a pH of 4.6 or less is considered high acid, 4.6 or higher is considered low acid. Now here is the pH of some of the foods that we can. So those on the low acid side, corn, chicken, beets, and potatoes. High acid, jam and jelly, pickles, sauerkraut, and apples. Then we've got tomatoes right in the middle. Some varieties of tomatoes are safely over on the acidic side, and others fall into the low acid side. And it's not necessarily the variety, the growing conditions can also affect the final level of acid in the product. So it's for that reason when we can tomatoes and tomato products at home, like salsa or just plain crushed tomatoes, they have to be acidified. We must add bottled lemon juice or powdered citric acid or even vinegar to get that acid safely in the high acid side so that we're not setting up the conditions for Clostridium botulinum bacteria to grow. So here's how that acid interacts with heat to control the bacteria. So if we take a food that is low in acid, like green beans, for example, and we subject that to mild heat, and we define mild heat up to the boiling point of water. The heat kills the living form of the bacteria. That's what the arrow going through the rectangle illustrates killing of the bacteria. But the spore, the green dot, survives that process. Whereas if we have something that's naturally high in acid or something that we've acidified, like for example, if we're making pickles, cucumbers by themselves are low in acid, but our pickling liquid has vinegar in it. We have some acid. The heat kills the living form of the bacteria and the acid suppresses the bacteria. So these arrows pushing down on the green dot, the spore, represents suppression of that spore. It doesn't allow it to germinate. It doesn't allow it to grow. So it's still there, but it can't harm us. Whereas we can apply severe heat. And if we apply severe heat above the boiling point of water in a pressure canner, we kill the living form of the bacteria and we kill the spore. So the way we get heat into the jar of food is by processing it in a canner. And processing means that we continue to cook the food after it goes into the jar. So on the left, we have the processing methods for high acid foods. We can process in a boiling water bath, which is just a large pot that has a rack on the bottom. We have that rack so that the jars don't dance around as the water boils in them, and so that the hot water can fully surround all parts of the jar. We've also have an atmospheric steam canner. This kind of looks like an inverted pot. There's a stage on the bottom that takes about 2 quarts of water, and it traps steam in that large domed lid. But it's at atmospheric pressure. That steam is not being pressurized, so it's a similar equivalent processing method to a boiling water bath. The nice thing about that is you only have a half a gallon of water to lift on and off the stove, whereas in the boiling water bath canner, you have many gallons of water that can be heavy to lift on and off of your stove, or if you've got a glass stove top, you don't want to put a lot of weight on that. Then over on the right, we have a pressure canner that we use to process low acid foods. In a pressure canner, we are trapping in the steam and the heat, and we're able to bring that boiling point of the water above 212 degrees. In a regular boiling water bath canner, we can put that pot on the stove all day and the temperature's not going to go any higher than 212 degrees. But when we pressurize the steam, we are able to get that pressure up, that temperature up to around 240 degrees. So sometimes people say, well, which is better, or which is faster, or which do you prefer? It's not a matter of preference or speed. It's, are you high acid or low acid? Now, sometimes people say, hey, I've learned about canning from my older relatives, and they told me you just put the food in the jar, close the lid, maybe turn a jar upside down, maybe cover it with a blanket, and then it's just good to go. That's called open kettle canning or hot fill hold. That method is not recommended. We've learned a lot about the science of canning in recent decades, and we know that for canned products to be safe, they must be processed. They have to continue to cook once they're put inside the jar. So we can acknowledge that that's something that used to be taught and a method that we used to follow, but not something that we want to follow today. We also have to factor in that the temperature of water boils at different temperatures at different elevations. So if we're high in elevation, we may need to increase our processing time. So a canning recipe will always tell you how long to process or how long to cook it for in the jar based on your elevation. And if you're processing in a pressure canner, you need to increase the pressure as elevation increases. And that's always noted in the recipe. If you do use a pressure canner, it's recommended that you get your dial gauge tested for accuracy every year. You can contact your local Penn State Extension office and we will test them for free. Because if you're not reading accurately, you could be under processing your food, and that could allow botulism spores to remain, and we could have that botulism risk later on. The next factor in home canning is getting a good seal to form. And when we've got a good seal formed, we've got a strong vacuum. So this unit is measuring in a lab what that looks like over on the right. It keeps the product in, keeps oxygen out, it keeps bacteria from the environment from getting inside of the jar and causing spoilage. And if we have a strong vacuum, it lets us know we've got a good seal. So here's how that forms. On the left, when we fill our jar, we leave some blank space at the top of the jar. It's called head space. That's just blank, plain air in the top of the jar. As the jar heats, everything expands, and that makes steam burp out of the jar and releases air that's in the top of the jar. Then when we take the jar out of the canner and let it cool, everything cools and contracts, and that's what sucks the lid down on the top of the jar. And we're left with a vacuum. A vacuum is just the absence of matter. It means there's nothing there. We've fully gotten the air out of the top of the jar. So to create a good vacuum, we want to make sure that we're starting with good jars that that are intact, that they're not chipped or cracked. We have the proper amount of head space, which is from the top of the level of the liquid to the lid of the jar. If we don't have enough head space, we can have some product seep out and get between the lid and the top of the jar and make our seal knot form. And if we have too much head space, we might not drive all of the air out of the jar, which means we could have mold growth or other spoilage later on. We take out the air bubbles before we put the lid on, because if there's air bubbles trapped in the food, that can work their way to the top as it's processing and increase our head space. And we want to keep moving while we're canning. If we have periods of warm product in our jar, but we let it cool down and then we put it in the canner, that temperature fluctuations can cause our seal not to form correctly. Whenever we're canning, we want to make sure that we're following safe sources of information, some that are tested in a laboratory to make sure that they are safe. Penn State Extension has a series of handouts called Let's Preserve. We also have a book available for purchase that has recipes, tips, storage guide, nutrition information. The National Center for Home Food Preservation is a safe source of info. They're actually a joint project between the University of Georgia and the USDA. University of Georgia has a book. Other Extension University publications are okay. And even the box of pectin, if you're making jam and jelly, those are okay. We do want to stay away from social media, from Pinterest groups, from Facebook canning groups, from homesteaders on YouTube. There is good information out there, but as much good information out there, there's unsafe information out there as well. We want to make sure that we know that we're using a safe method so that we don't accidentally kill our friends and family. We also want to follow that recipe exactly. When it says to measure out 3 cups of one item, it doesn't mean we just kind of eyeball it and say, "Oh, that looks right," or we have a couple extra pieces of fruit. I'm just going to throw it in there. No modifications are allowed to the recipe unless it says so, and we measure exactly. We also don't know if grandma's recipe or processing method will be safe. But I realized that there's a lot of memories tied back to grandma's recipe. So what we would recommend is find a safe tested recipe that's similar, and that might be close enough and you still have that memory, or go ahead and make grandma's recipe, but store it in the refrigerator. Don't keep it at room temperature. It's also worth noting that there are some foods that cannot be canned at home, and you can buy them at the grocery store, but we cannot create the conditions at home that make them safe. So one of those is pumpkin pie filling, and we get questions all the time about that. It's just too thick. It's too dense. We cannot make a safe product at home, but there's some alternatives. So you could freeze pumpkin pie filling, or you could can chunks of pumpkin in water. Kind of like when you buy green beans at the store, there's green beans in water. That water helps to facilitate the spread of heat to the center of the jar. Broccoli just gets soft. Summer squash and zucchini, if you can them by themselves, they just get really soft and mush. There are some pickle recipes for those, though. We also want to stay away from anything with starch, so cornstarch, flour, noodles, and other products like eggs and milk. Those can slow heat transfer, and they can cause our product then to be unsafe. But it's really simple. You can chicken and carrots and celery and broth, and then you just add noodles to it when you go to serve it. Or if you want to make tomato soup, can plain tomato sauce or tomato juice, and then when you go to heat it up, thicken it with cornstarch or flour. You can add cheese and add milk then. So the next few slides, we need to give credit to our friends at the University of Missouri Extension for putting these slides together that briefly talk through the actual process of setting up and using a pressure canner or boiling water bath canner. So a lot of the equipment you need is already in your kitchen, but there's a couple things that you will need. A jar lifting tool, a jar funnel is very nice to help fill up your jars. Some methods will give multiple options for packing. You can do a hot pack or a raw pack. In a hot pack, your food is pre-cooked, which means it's less likely to float and you can fit a little bit more food in the jar. But some give the option for a raw pack, and some people prefer this just because it's faster. You take raw food and then cover it with boiling water. I mentioned earlier adjusting the headspace. So your tested recipe will always tell you how much headspace you need, but in general, it's 1/4 of an inch for jam and jelly, 1/2 an inch for acidic foods like fruits and tomatoes, and 1 inch or even up to 1.25 inches for low acid foods that we're processing in a pressure canner. We do want to measure this, and we want to measure it every time, regardless of how often you've been doing it. We don't just want to eyeball, we want to measure so that we have the best chance of success of our jar not unsealing and our jar staying safe. I mentioned that the jars can be reused. Our ring bands that we tighten the lids on can be reused, but we do want to use a new lid every time. The underside of the lid has some sealing compound, and that softens when our jars are in the canner. And then when we have that vacuum seal being formed, it sucks the lids down into that indentation, and that's what holds our lids fast. If we go to reuse those lids, we don't have a lot of sealing compound left, and you might get a weak seal to form, but it's much more likely to come unsealed. And you don't want to waste all of that time to go through that process and then just have your jars become unsealed. We do want to follow the directions for every recipe carefully. Look it up every time for your processing time, and that can vary by your jar size as well. So make sure you're referencing and following those directions. So in a pressure canner, we are not covering the jars with water. There's only about 2 or 3 inches in the bottom of the in the bottom of the canner that produces steam inside the chamber. So we take our prepared jars, use the jar lifter so we don't burn ourselves, load them into the rack on the bottom of the canner. We put on the lid and we turn on the heat, and we allow steam to escape from the canner for 10 minutes. This is an important step that sometimes people skip. If we don't do this, we're trapping regular air inside the canner, and we're not allowing that full energy from the pressurized steam to transfer into the jar. So we have to replace that air in the chamber with steam. Then we close the petcock valve or add our regulator weight. We let the pressure rise to the target pressure, usually 11 pounds of pressure, but always check your recipe. We set our timer. We time for the entire process time. Then we let the heat naturally drop to 0 after we've turned off the burner. Once our pressure goes back to 0, we remove the weight or open the petcock valve and wait 10 more minutes. This is another time that people sometimes skip that step. If we skip that step, we can have something called siphonage. That's where the water boils out of the jar before the vacuum seal begins to form. So people will call us and say, hey, there's half the liquid is missing from my jar. Why did that happen? You could have cooled too quickly. Then we open the lid, take our jars out with the jar lifter and set them onto a protected surface, like a wooden cutting board, a towel, and we let the jars sit undisturbed for 12 to 24 hours. A boiling water bath canner, similar. We prepare our jars, we put them in the canner, but in a boiling water bath canner, the water covers the jars by 1 to 2 inches. We start our timer when the water boils. After our processing time is up, we remove the lid from the canner and let them sit in the warm water for 5 minutes. Again, this is to protect from siphoning, similar to the pressure canning step. After our jars come out of the water, resist the urge to poke on the top of the jar to test for the seal. If we test our seal before the jar sealed on its own and we push down and that makes the jar seal, that doesn't count. It has to seal on its own for it to count as a sealed jar. If the jar is not sealed, you can put it back in the refrigerator and just eat it out of there. Or if you have a lot that didn't seal, you could reprocess using new lids. We want to remove the screw band, wash underneath, and then store them in a cool, dry place with the ring band off. Even though we followed a research-tested recipe, we want to make sure that if a jar does come unsealed, we're not masking that by putting the ring band on. We want the lid to come unsealed and we know that there's a problem. Label our jars so that we can eat them within 1 year for best quality. If you're interested in learning more about this process, we just did a brief overview Like I said, we have a book available for purchase. We'll also email this out at the end, but you can scan the QR code if you'd like. You'll also get a copy of the slides, so you don't have to frantically capture all this right now. We also have a series of handouts that talk about specific fruits and vegetables and meats that you may be interested in referencing from our website. You can also sign up to receive our home food preservation newsletter. This has comes out a couple times a year, and you can get it electronically or get that through email. Um, we also have a series of webinars. Now, there's a few more this year. A lot of them have already passed, but if you find out about the if you sign up for the newsletter, then you can also find out about our upcoming webinars. We also have a few in-person workshops throughout the state, but those are on a more limited basis. We do have an evaluation. This will come out in the follow-up email as well, or if you'd like to scan the QR code now, you can. This evaluation is important for our annual reporting so that we can share and measure the impact in the community. Also provides feedback to our boss, who doesn't often get to see us in action. So we have about 10 more minutes. Would love to take some questions that you have. I see some already in the Q&A. Nicole and I have also answered some already. So if you go to the Q&A button, you can click on the answered button and you can read through those answers there. So somebody made more of a comment saying that, hey, foodborne botulism isn't that common. Is there a way to balance safe canning practices and not scare people so they don't want to try that? So here's the thing. Uh, Botulism is a serious concern. While it's rare, that's due to the education that folks at Penn State Extension and at other universities constantly do as well, so that we get that risk low. But it does happen. There's actually a really interesting story. If you go to YouTube and search Utah botulism, Utah State University has a good story of a botulism survivor. And when it does happen, it's very serious. So here's the thing. Follow research tested recipes and follow the directions, and you'll be fine. If you do your own thing, you want to be creative while canning, and you follow unsafe sources, then you have that risk. So um, follow the proper procedures, and you'll be fine. Um, okay. How long is canned food safe for? Um, a, a year for best quality. It can go beyond that, but you're really going to start to notice the quality suffering. At one point, does it become unsafe? It's not really a matter of safety. It's more so the quality. A couple questions about vacuum sealing jars with a machine. They make jars, they make vacuum seal attachments that will seal on the top of a lid of a jar. But that is not the same as canning. That's for storing dry goods. And some people, maybe want to vacuum seal and put something in the refrigerator, but we would never want to use a handheld vacuum seal attachment and store that jar at room temperature. That is not the same. That could really result in an unsafe product because botulism grows at room temperature in the absence of oxygen. So if we're not controlling that through extreme heat or through controlling acid, then that's a concern. Let me see, Nicole. I'm just catching up here on what other questions there are.
I had also answered a question earlier, Andy, kind of related to that. Somebody asked, where was it? Can you can dry goods like flour, rice, etc.? And we don't recommend any kind of dry canning, but if you wanted to like vacuum seal them or something just for longer storage, that would be perfectly acceptable. But we don't recommend actually dry canning them.
There's a question somebody wanted to know about canning, um, apple cider. Wanted to know if there's a way to get it month unopened in the refrigerator, ideally with a swing top bottle or other serving vessels. So that's kind of more less from the home food preservation um, into something else. I mean, essentially, apple cider is just unfiltered apple juice. As far as canning apple juice, we do filter out the sediment, so we're not including the sediment that's included in cider. You could always freeze it as a way to keep it longer. And you're kind of asking two questions here, asking about pasteurization. There are some resources for doing it's called batch pasteurization for apple cider. You're heating that up to kill harmful microorganisms. And getting off on a tangent here, but a concern with cider can be that you use less desirable apples, some that might be a little misshapen, diseased, or even some that fell on the ground. And the concern there is, deer and other critters run through the field, and we can just pick up contaminants that way. And some can be, there have been outbreaks of E. coli, for example, in associated with cider that's not been pasteurized. So, um, mm, happy to connect you if you want to send me an email, and I'll put my email in the chat. I can get you connected to actually, he's a food science professor who specializes in plant foods. Actually, I'll just give you his email. You can go right to him. His name is Dr. Luke Laborde. It's LFL5 at psu.edu. Okay, Nicole, where are we at? I jumped away from
I can
the
read one to
question screen
you.
for a while. Yeah.
Is there any issue with processing too long when canning other than mushy food?
Um, no. Yeah, it's just mostly quality.
Okay. Somebody asked just a little bit more detail on how raw pack works when canning.
Hang on, sorry. I just realized I didn't put Hi, Sharon Watson. I messaged that exactly
Oh,
accidentally
sure.
directly to you. Now I sent it to everyone. And I know Sharon and her son. Um, uh, Raw pack, how does that work for canning? So you take raw food, put it in a jar, you cover that with boiling water, and then add your lid, and then you still process that in a canner. Um, versus a hot pack where the food is cooked a little bit. Like I said, with raw pack, it floats a little bit, and you don't get quite as much in the jar because there's natural air present in the food. So when you start to cook it a little bit, that air comes out and it shrinks a little bit. Um, I personally always do hot pack if you have the choice, but some people prefer raw pack because it's faster.
Is there any safe way to preserve eggs besides freeze drying them?
You can put them in the regular freezer, but the quality and texture is going to change. You can use them in a casserole or things like that. Um, but I mean, you could eat them, plain if you wanted to, but the texture is going to be different. We get this question a lot. Some people say, "Hey, I found something on this website about water glassing, where you take your egg and you mix up a solution of lime and put it in that water." That's an outdated method that's no longer recommended. It also does not control bacteria. With eggs, we have bacteria on the surface, but we also have bacteria on the inside of the egg as well. So it's not about protecting them from the environment. Um, it's about protecting them from protecting us from bacteria that are found in chicken. Chickens have one way out. It's called their cloaca. They poop out that hole, and eggs come out that same hole. So we've got we've got a concern there, and that's why we have sometimes foodborne illness associated with eggs. So again, don't let that scare you. Wash your hands after you handle eggs, cook them thoroughly, and we're good to go.
This next question I can answer if you want. How long can foods like flour, rice, etc. be stored, especially to keep bugs out? If you're concerned with bugs, definitely recommend transferring them to a different type of container than what they came in, like one of those plastic storage containers, or you can use your vacuum sealer for this to keep the bugs out. You can store it in your freezer for longer storage, but I would just refer to most of those packages should have some kind of best by date on them. And those aren't necessarily based on food safety. They're just when the product should be eaten for best flavor and quality. So you can go by those as just like a general rule of thumb, but most of those products can last a pretty long time. The quality is going to diminish before there is a food safety concern with those.
Hey, somebody says, hey, botulism is the main reason I've yet to try canning. I have ADHD. Is there a way for me to double check to know my canned good is safe prior to opening and eating? So unfortunately with botulism, no, you can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't taste it. It doesn't produce gas, so it's not going to make your lid become unsecured. Stick with things that are high in acid naturally. Fruits, jam and jelly, we're not worried about that. Um, there other things that we acidify like pickles. We just want to make sure that we're measuring accurately. So you can pre-measure it and have everything sitting out on the counter. And that way, you've double checked it. You're not, watching the pickles boil on the stove and mixing your brine. Those are some ways that you can help with that. You can also can with a friend. And actually, I know the person who answered that, so call me up. I'll come can with you sometime.
So put in the chat, last call for questions if anybody has any other questions. We have about 2 more minutes left.
All right. Oh, did I see one pop up? Oh, nope, just someone thanking you for a great presentation. So,
I
all
am going to put
right.
our email addresses in the chat just in case anybody thinks of something later.
That would be great. All right, Andy and Nicole, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. Very timely, as I said, as we move from summer into fall season. I hope you all found this very beneficial. I know there was a lot of information, so we will be sending a follow-up email later today with the slides and the recording so that you can revisit all this information along with the QR codes and the evaluation that was in there as well. So again, Andy, Nicole, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today and share all this information. Thank you to all our participants that joined in for the hour. If you're interested, our next Lunch and Learn is going to be on September 18th with Empower Financial Advisors. They are going to be talking about the sandwich generation. So looking at financial wellness. And so stay tuned for more advertisements with that. And if there's no other questions or comments, then I will go ahead and end the presentation. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful
Bye,
day.
everyone.